Hi everyone, my name is Hans-Ulrich Obest. I'm the Artistic Director of the Serpentine, and we are so delighted to welcome you all tonight here to celebrate the launch of Future Ecosystems number 3, Art and Decentralized Tech. I hope you already got or will all get the small booklet, which is actually the 3rd volume in this series. We're incredibly grateful, of course, to Reference Point, to Sophia, to Jonah, and everybody else here. And it's great, a few weeks really after having all been here with Kasim for the new currency event, to be back here at Reference Point. We're incredibly thrilled to actually share with you all the vital research which went into actually the ways how decentralized technologies are evolving, new opportunities, new possibilities for artists, but also for cultural organization and for society as a whole. The report number 3 not only convenes interdisciplinary conversations on art and advanced technologies, it's the whole idea of going beyond the fear of pooling knowledge, breaking down silos of knowledge, but it also stands as a blueprint how actually these powerful innovations can be applied to the world. We look forward to putting these findings into action in all the work we do, building actually towards the Serpentine's mission of building new alliances. Isabel Stengers and Ilya Prigozhin once wrote a book about that, the necessity in our time to create new alliances, but also building new connections between artists and society. Of course, at the core of all of this since 2013, and so it's soon 10 years that we started with Ben Vickers, the Arts and Technology Project at the Serpentine, and have developed programs that seek to challenge and reshape really the role that technologies can play in culture and society today. The program initiates and supports artists actually in developing ambitious artworks that deploy advanced technologies. And we were inspired really at the beginning by Billy Kluwer and the initiative of experiments in art and technology, where Billy Kluwer in the 1960s worked very closely with Bell Laboratories. We went to meet Lilian Schwarz and also Rauschenberg at the time, who was still alive, who were part of this EAT project, where artists could very closely work with technologists and engineers and produce reality together. So we thought, from EAT to NEAT, kind of creating new experiments in art and technology. A second main inspiration really was from the beginning, 10 years ago, to then also bring this R&D work into society, to basically, of course, create the infrastructure for, the art world, for artists, for institutions, which we can share, but also to then think how we can all of this bring somehow into society. And of course, Barbara Stevini and John Latham pioneered this idea of APG, of the Artist Placement Group, where they said that basically every organization, governmental organization, every private corporation, company should have an artist at the table where decisions are made, should have an artist on the board. So we hope that that's going to happen more and more also in the sector of technology. The time has come to make this, in big parts, unrealized project of Barbara Stevini and John Latham a concrete reality, and that's very much at the core, in a way, of what we do at the Serpentine. The idea, of course, is also with the evolving R&D platform to nurture innovation actually for future art ecologies by securing very important institutional spaces for very concrete intervention, but also to allow this possibility of risk-taking, the idea of risk-taking, of experiments. And then, of course, it's about holistic kind of programming. Very often our tech team works with the exhibition team on exhibitions to bring actually these research and R&D work into exhibitions like Ian Cheng, Hito Steil, Jenna Sutela, Pierre Wieg, are examples, but then also projects more recently like Trust or Sao Fe. And we are very excited at the moment to actually work with the Brazilian artist Gabriel Massan and a team of collaborators, and then to soon launch Third World, which is a consciousness-raising game, a video game that explores Black indigenous Brazilian experiences, and is also accompanied by a blockchain-based project, and will also become an exhibition project at the Serpentine. So this idea, of course, of video games is so important. 2.8 billion people played last year video games. That's a third of the world population. And it's interesting that so many artists already since the 70s, if you think about Rebecca Allen or Peggy Avage, like many pioneering artists have actually worked with video games early on. Of course, more and more artists have decided to go into video games and use them as a platform, but we think particularly interesting, and that's what Gabriel Massan's example is, that we have now more and more artists who actually develop and invent their own games. They're making their own worlds with rules surrounding systems, and that means that new worlds are emerging, and with the technology being more accessible, we see a plurality of voices in games, and these games are not necessarily manufactured actually only for specific audiences, but also for the benefit of peers. So we're extremely excited to soon present you all this project of Gabriel Massan. We think actually that it's urgent to continue to create space for artists who are actively striving to shape technology for the future. And I want to here really thank our dream team, our extraordinary arts and technology team, Victoria Ivanova, Eva Jäger, Roisin McVeigh, Alex Boyce, Tamar Clark-Brown, and also Kay Watson. We should give them all a very big round of applause. And it's now my immense pleasure to hand over the microphone to my colleague, Kay Watson. Please give Kay a very warm welcome.
Don't get too excited yet. I'm not giving the presentation. Thank you, Hans-Ulrich. My name, as you know, is Kay, and I first want to start by saying hello to the Twitch audience. Everyone should say hi to the Twitch audience. We're going for full hybridity tonight, so if you are watching at home or wherever you are, please do leave questions in the chat. Alex will relay those to the team. And if you cannot see, and thank you everyone for your patience tonight, it's very busy, and that's really wonderful. But thank you for your patience. If you want to look at the stream, we're on Twitch at Serpentine UK. So as you know, I'm Head of Arts Technologies at Serpentine. We are a department, as Hans-Ulrich has described, with two pillars. We support artists working with art and advanced technologies, and we do that through commissioning and production. We build teams, we support artists to develop complex projects. And we also do R&D, and this is our R&D platform. And this is a way of us having a more sustained, experimental focus that can transform the way that we operate as an institution. And Future Art Ecosystems has been a vital part of that process for the last 3 years. And so, of course, we are very pleased to be launching the third volume tonight, Future Art Ecosystems 3. And from now on, we're going to refer to it as FAE3, because that's our chosen acronym. Which will be, and you'll hear more about this, identifying new patterns for organisational and creative innovation within the broader space of decentralized technologies. So as you'll hear in the briefing, this articulates how practitioners and the cultural sector at large can develop and implement production, distribution, and financial support systems in new ways. It's also the beginning of a new chapter for FAE. We'll be shifting into a new developmental mode. We will be prototyping and testing protocols, which we hope that many of you in the room will be a part of going forward. So, of course, please bear with me, I need to thank everybody who has been a part of this, not only today, but over the years. So FAE3 is informed by a network of practitioners and organisations that contribute to this ever-expanding ecosystem. None of this would be possible without this ecosystem. So there are too many to name, but we are extremely grateful to this year's contributors and researchers who have given their time and expertise so generously. I'd also like to thank our advisors, Seb Chan, Maria Paula Fernandez, Aslak Amot Helm, Sophia Netchaev, Katrina Sluis, and Rival Strategy. We're also incredibly grateful to Harm van den Dorpel and Sarah Friend for their artistic contributions this year. To Roxy Zaiher, Ralph Pritchard, James Reeford of Black Shuck Co-op, and Sarah Shin, we thank, as always, for their ongoing time, patience, and support. To Paula Berman, Matt Pruitt, and Alex Randaccio, I hope I said that right, from Radical Exchange for helping us to design and for facilitating the session tonight. Finally, a huge thank you to Gary Zexi Zhang, who has co-produced and co-written FAE3 this year with my brilliant colleagues. And I'm going to hand you over to some of those brilliant colleagues now. A round of applause for Ava, Victoria, and Gary.
We only have 2 mics. Okay. Hi, everyone. Thanks for being here tonight. My name is Victoria Vanova, and I am R&D Strategic Lead.
Hi, everyone. My name is Ava Yeager, and I'm Curator at Arts Technologies at Serpentine.
Hi, my name is Gary Zaxi-Sang. I'm an artist and writer and co-author of Phase 3.
So, we will introduce the key ideas of Future Art Ecosystems 3, Art and Decentralized Technologies, through the lens of this question. How can decentralized technologies be harnessed to help bring about a more interoperable cultural sector? So we will first do this by explaining how we landed on the concept of interoperability as a desirable and necessary quality of future art ecosystems. And then we'll walk you through our approach to the decentralized technology space in terms of the early primers that the latter has to offer in building new organizations and reforming the existing ones. So our plan is to have a 30-minute, very quick presentation. We will then transition to a more dynamic conversation, hopefully fun feedback session, guided by Paula Berman of Radical Exchange using the Polis tool. So what was the starting point of future art ecosystems? You heard a little bit from Hans Ulrich and Kay, but to kind of elaborate, it's a series of briefings that is dedicated to organizational development and ecosystem design in the cultural sector. And why did we decide to start one? So probably many of us here would agree that contemporary culture production holds a lot of promise for metabolizing complex or urgent contemporary issues, whether that's in relationship to technology or other larger societal phenomena. And there are a couple of reasons for that, which are almost a cliche. First, interdisciplinarity. Contemporary culture can be a meeting point for specialists from different fields who are galvanized to bring their discipline or sector-specific approaches into a collective conversation on an issue that cuts across multiple domains, such as the various social, legal, philosophical, and economic questions that are raised by various advanced technologies, from AI to blockchain to synthetic biology. Second, non-instrumentality or artistic culture production. Well, at the very least, not in the direct instrumental logics of shipping products or having to directly resolve a concrete issue. This allows for interdisciplinary culture production to have an exploratory potential, the value of which goes beyond the final output and is found in the process of collaboration and translating across differences. Third, and this is probably one of the most key, at least for this conversation here, is cultural production as a public good. Now, what public good entails may be subject to constant renegotiation, but it is an absolutely critical aspirational benchmark, particularly as art and advanced technologies, and here's another acronym we'll use throughout the night, AxAT, Art and Advanced Technologies, offers a context for interrogating and reimagining technology as a social and creative medium in societies where today technological development is largely driven by interests of commerce and control.
So this vision is close to our hearts and likely also the reason that many of you work in this field. But Faye asks, can current organizational setup of the cultural field really deliver on this vision of contemporary cultural production? And particularly given that AxAT materials like data sets, software, hardware, network protocols, etc., typically are instrumentalized despite the public's best interest, it's crucial to invest in mid to long-term advancements of projects such that artistic interrogation could actually be influential on emerging technologies and policies. And without this, we risk taking a kind of superficial or even cynical approach to cultural production without harnessing the potentials of interdisciplinarity, exploration, and meaningful public engagement. So in the inaugural issue of Faye, we explored specific operational needs of AxAT projects. So the circumstances of their dynamic materials, the needs for extensive networks, expertise, and proficiencies to undertake these projects. And Phase 1 concluded with 3 possible trajectories for organizational adaptation to these needs. These are described along the axes of openness and systems orientation. So here they're plotted. The existing institutional setup generally either leverages the tech industry as an art patron, or it works with already highly professionalized artistic practices. And the final option, which is really what we're advocating for, is that we could reconfigure entirely towards an open, systems-oriented approach. But in order to do that, the sector requires what Faye calls 21st century cultural infrastructure, the appropriate systems to produce, distribute, and financially support experimental artistic engagements with emerging and advanced technologies. And so with Faye, the objective is to develop this operational imaginary. How can we get there? Through language, arguments, and ultimately the infrastructure for the art ecosystems that Victoria just described.
Future art ecosystems too. So Art and Metaverse does exactly that. It develops a language and arguments for 21st century cultural infrastructure in the context of metaverse technologies and their existing and potential impact on cultural production, distribution, and experience. And in Phase 2, rather than approaching the metaverse as an extension of brick-and-mortar institutions in virtual spaces, which would be the status quo approach that was just shown on the 2x2, we propose to rethink the basic building blocks of digital strategy, or what we call developmental vectors, that could ladder up to redefine how cultural institutions deliver their public missions in the age of advanced virtual environments and their dominant economic models. So the questions that we ask with Phase 2 are, how can institutions get better at doing advanced production for artistic experimentation? How can a greater diversity of economic and distribution models be leveraged to support the cultural sector? What new metrics, beyond footfall and media visibility, would need to be devised to allow for the value of culture production to be recognized for its multifaceted potential? And perhaps the somewhat obvious answer is that no institution can implement all of these strategies on its own. These vectors can only be realized or even conceived of at the scale of a sector or an ecosystem, which is where interoperability becomes key, as a coordination system for connecting the various capabilities of a more organizationally diverse sector.
So currently these vectors feel like very far aspirations in the daily lives of people who work in cultural institutions. Their ambitions to consciously develop institutional capabilities are often sidelined by the demands of remaining financially afloat with short-term funding cycles and focusing on discrete projects instead of being mission-driven. These demands disincentivize a more expansive and systems-oriented form of working with transformational technology like machine intelligence or synthetic biology or virtual world building. At its core, today's art ecosystem is based on actually the separation of functions between artistic production, distribution, and financial support. And while these systems may work for some art practices, they're just simply too rigid for AxAT, and it risks this formation many negative externalities, which we've shown here in this diagram after Gregory Bateson. So for instance, a scarcity and exclusivity model emerges when institutional legitimization plays too much of a role in determining the viability of a practice, or constrained innovation where value of these practices is rarely traveling across society and benefiting society. And unsustainable competition also emerges across actors who fight for limited resources from the same pots.
Instead, a new imaginary and roadmap for organizational development that has interoperability between diverse and mission-oriented organizations at its heart is required. One where existing organizations and new ones can meet to articulate new formations. This requires seeing organizational prototyping as something more compostable and composable. And so this is where our interest in decentralized technological imaginaries comes in, and in interoperability as a way of distributing and combining organizational proficiencies. So what do we mean when we say decentralized tech? In the context of FAE3, we're really talking about tools, practices, and imaginaries that are formed around blockchain, Web3, and the decentralized web over the past 5 years or so. At the same time, we recognize that the value of a much longer historical arc is also in play, and decentralized tech has also previously been exemplified by movements like peer-to-peer and open source communities, and even more by the distributed and interconnected nature of Web 1.0, rather than the massive decentralized platforms with which we associate Web 2.0. At the most basic level, we view dweb, decentralized web, and Web 3 as attempts to circle back to a more financially, politically, and technically distributed version of the web. This is particularly crucial today because how the web as a social infrastructure is organized is equally as significant for guiding the direction of society as other infrastructures like public healthcare and climate policy. There is, of course, a lot of nuance and complexity when we start talking about decentralization. And by no means we mean that, let's say, a smart contract can somehow solve the problems of the art world and build more resilient AxAT ecosystems. We take the view that, like many emergent social technological paradigms, we don't know what these technologies are yet. But as the noise of promise and hype clear away, we can identify that in decentralized tech narratives, there are new patterns for production, distribution, and financing, which are already mutating some of the key concepts of cultural infrastructure towards what we see as more interoperable ends.
And so with FAE3, we discern and articulate a set of primitives, that is, rudimentary operational propositions that leverage decentralized technologies towards such reconfiguration. First, retooling artistic authenticity. Now, the value and identity of art has always been caught somewhere between the identity of the artist, the fact of the work, and the community of interest that forms around it. By contrast, decentralized culture production is often, although not exclusively, untethered from an individual identity, developing as more of a collective narrative, often driven by fandoms or speculative investment. Compared to the way in which provenance, authenticity, and value are ascribed in the legacy formation, so the traditional art world, through various forms of institutional legitimization and verification, decentralized culture production points towards artistic authenticity as being caught somewhere between automated verification and community-driven evolution of the work that ideally can continue growing through network effects. So less the myth of the solo genius artist, more indie game studios and skeleton film crews. An interdependent community of writers, artists, technologists, curators that circulate around myth or aura whose reproduction is the bread and butter of institutions responsible for distribution cultural capital in the legacy art world. And distributing the aura brings organizational and collective practices, research, development process, and equity among stakeholders in the supply chain into focus and into possible new formations. So the question with the possibilities of retooling artistic authenticity through decentralized technologies or their imaginaries is, how can the value chain of art be reoriented towards collaborative and network forms of creative R&D? And here we give an example of an existing practice that's kind of moving in that direction. So musicians Holly Herndon's Holly Plus, which distributes the artist's aura through a digital instrument based on the artist's voice, allowing fans to make their own voice deepfakes based on Holly Plus, with the IP managed by a stakeholder-owned DAO.
The second primitive that we identify is spontaneous innovation, and this is a kind of chaotic one. FAE3 observes the collapsing of economic, technological, and social dimensions in decentralized technology space. And this offers a lot of new affordances for simultaneously researching, developing, and deploying all at the same time. And these have been directed towards tools for collective decision-making, financing, and archiving. And we see also that this innovation in the decentralized technology space tends to be highly bottom-up and community-driven. And that the technical projects are kind of performative enactments of social aspirations and cultural identifications for the communities that gather around them. And at the same time, we also see that art or art-adjacent cultural propositions serve as really powerful catalysts for this creative R&D. So here we ask the question, how can artists and cultural organizations allow for spontaneous innovation through tools-based projects that could serve as early blueprints for AxAT infrastructure building? And an example of this is an open source tool, Polis, which is a sentiment analysis tool for community deliberation. And we're going to be using this tool shortly to collectively answer that beginning question. And our experiment with this is an effort to understand how art could be a catalyst for aligning around ideas of reform in a really efficient but also nuanced way.
A third primitive we've identified we're calling new systems ontologies. So a significant impact of decentralized technologies has been the reconfiguration of pretty basic concepts within artistic as well as technical processes. Put another way, Web3 and dweb are animating new metaphors for how we use, develop, and live by digital technologies. In particular, the two-handed nature of socialization and financialization of processes like storage, identity, and cultural transmission have had significant implications for AxAT practices. For example, on the technical side, the development of dweb infrastructures such as Interplanetary File System, or IPFS, a peer-to-peer protocol in which every user of the internet is also a client and also is simultaneously a client and a server for the network, quite similar to file sharing protocols or mesh networks, has represented an important step towards building a web that is much more resilient, addressable, and self-archiving. One advancement in this is the sign that Internet Archive has been building their infrastructure around IPFS in recent years. Meanwhile, where Web 2 platforms viewed users largely as atomized consumer identities, blockchain tools like DAOs have catalyzed an organizational movement around pseudonymous and mutable collective identities that function somewhere between fandom communities, corporations, and artistic collectives, who wield network effects to their advantage. So the question we have here is, how can we prototype more peer-to-peer, interdependent, and resilient forms of cultural infrastructure? The recent crisis that fermented around Twitter after its takeover by Elon Musk is a good example of how a centralized and privatized form of pseudo-public space can be rapidly threatened, which is then followed by signs of a potential mass migration to a decentralized social platform like Mastodon once people worked out how to use it. Still, this runs into conflict with the social pull of network effects, and no one wants to be the first to move away. But it's a sign of how quickly the winds can change and how fragile our ecosystems really are. What is clearly required are more democratic forms of public digital infrastructure, ideally owned and governed with a mandate from its users. So we treat these three primitives as jumping off points, which are not without gaps and limitations. They are drawn from what we see existing in the patterns within decentralized tech. And particularly, there are questions relating to durability, legal status, regulation, spaces for alternative non-networked forms of creative R&D, as well as questions over the delivery of public value. But by sifting and salvaging organizational primitives and trying to understand how they can be hybridized and augmented towards more interoperable ecosystems in the cultural sector, this has led us to 6 prospective qualities and principles. So the first of these is cultural production as a public good. We think of the public simply here as an involuntary relationship to commons-oriented ownership, as opposed to the self-initiated communities of the willing that we've often seen around decentralized technologies. Second is an interoperable service ecosystem. Cultural infrastructure here is imagined as a highly interconnected system of capabilities and capacities rather than a landscape of institutional fortresses. Third, tools create culture. So here it's more about encouraging the communities and cultures that rather organically already form around the exploration of new technologies. Fourth, value in creative R&D. That's something that we've emphasized throughout the FAY reports, which is measuring, identifying, and investing in the processes of cultural production and not only the resulting content. Fifth, open source. That's simple enough. It's about developing tools and projects with sharing, adaptation, and reuse in mind, fostered by investment in documentation processes, as well as permissive IP. And sixth and finally, new ownership models, using technology to explore different structures of public stakeholdership, artistic attribution, economic distribution, and financing.
So let me zoom out for a second. Whoa. The joys of Miro. No, but I want to see the bigger picture first. Okay, let's see the bigger picture. It's a bigger picture where you can't see the detail, which is usually the case for the bigger picture. So Phase 3 ends with a series. So this was fast, right? It ends, but there's a book that has far more detail, which we encourage you to read. Please don't forget it here. Phase 3 ends with a series of pathways for building a 21st century cultural infrastructure that has these highly aspirational qualities. We identify 3 possible pathways towards that vision in the final chapter of the briefing. But what is critical to understand is that a lot of these pathways are already in development, or at the very least, the ingredients for their manifestation are there. And many of you here in this room are a testament to that and are driving these initiatives. What is, however, lacking is sustained investment and a new approach to metrics that can allow for these agendas to be explicitly and unapologetically articulated and followed through. So we can now see a bit of detail. Not this one, though. This one. So the first pathway that we propose is developing a more continuous and decentralized infrastructure that enables practices of distributed organization. Key here is value alignment around legal standards, metrical coordination, and creation of various forms of interdependence up and down the supply chain. So not just on projects and commissions between organizations and various entities, but on an operational level. So imagine GitHub for the arts.
So the next one is distributed ownership, where we think about how we can reconfigure risk-taking and investment across distributed networks of stakeholders. So how can we pluralize ownership in all of the different ways in which it manifests in the cultural sphere and cultural production? And we have to understand that ownership is not just about possession and exploitation, but more importantly about risk, responsibility, and custodianship. So key here is reconfiguring and enabling greater stakeholder participation in all aspects of projects, including financing, production, and distribution. And a nice example of a distributed ownership project is Furtherfield's Culture Stake, a tool that connects communities, artists, and organizations through collective cultural decision-making utilizing quadratic voting. And its goal, among others, is to end elitism in the arts by opening cultural decision-making to wider groups and providing them more agency, and also to enable people to have a real stake and say in what happens in their locality.
The final pathway we've called modular AxAT practices, decentering the individual, distributing the aura, and hybridizing authorship. So, as many of you here will recognize, an informal and de facto interoperability already exists between AxAT practitioners, often in the sharing of technical skills, networks, and expertise, deriving from the hybrid nature of their practices. The aura emanating from the individual artist's genius turns out to be a kind of smokescreen behind which interdependent collaborators, producers, programmers, technicians, writers, fabricators, subsist, many of whom are artists themselves. As such, artists or contemporary artists are arbitraging constantly between the material conditions of collective labor and the production of individual aura demanded by the legacy formation of the art world. Echoing past cooperative initiatives like Artist Pension Trust, DAO-like structures could offer tools for shepherding resources and pooling uneven collective income. Given the typically complex and collaborative nature of AxAT projects, the the multiple outputs and impacts they can have, and the hybrid and collective identities that are often more adequate than solo artist personas. So here we're back to the skeleton film crews and the indie game studios. The diffusion of aura would also mean that hybrid practitioners can operate across multiple collective entities and projects in a manner which compounds rather than detracts from their legibility and standing as solo artists. An example of a modular AxAT practice, in a sense, is the Artist, Designer, and Technologist Community Trust based in Berlin, some of whose members are here today. Initially formed as a co-working space, Trust these days functions as a research community running internal and public discursive programs, a de facto brain trust for a collaborative network of practitioners in Berlin and across the world, and at different points an artistic and production entity which develops projects with institutions, as well as itself playing host to a number of smaller organizational nodes, such as Zero Exile and Black Swan DAO, AxAT entities in their own right.
And we're back to original questions. So we've come full circle to the question, how can decentralized technology be harnessed to help bring about a more interoperable cultural sector? So at this point, I'd like to welcome Paola Berman from Radical Exchange to lead into the next chapter of this evening.
Hello, everyone. Good evening. I'm Paula Berman, and I'm with Radical Exchange Foundation. And right now I'm going to facilitate an exercise where we're going to deliberate using a platform, a digital platform, that embodies some of the goals that were just aligned to you in this presentation. And more specifically, it's a platform that is designed to help us find areas of common ground so that we can use these insights to inform collective action. So in a sense, we're already starting an experiment here where we're taking the aims of the report and putting them into practice this night by doing a collective deliberation together, which can then hopefully inform future ways in which we can carry the work of coordinating around achieving some of the goals that are in this wonderful report. So I'm going to talk about how we're going to do that in a moment, but first I want to tell you a little bit about Radical Exchange. We are a nonprofit, but we're also a movement that is distributed around the world. And we work to conceptualize and develop new and improved ways of doing governance in distributed, decentralized ways. No, I'm okay. And so we work with many of these different primitives, voting, deliberating, which is what we're going to do tonight, but also funding public goods, new ways of thinking about property regimes, how we exchange value with each other, identity. These are all social technologies that give us interesting affordances for how to organize collectively, how to share power with each other. And what we want to do is to upgrade these social technologies so that they can help us create more pluralistic societies, so they can have more pluralistic designs. And by that, I mean that we want these social technologies to help us recognize social difference. So what are the different social dimensions? What are the different social groupings? What are the different positions that exist within a community? We want to get a good resolution into these differences for a couple of reasons. The first is that when we're looking at sort of the quality of a decision, if it's made by a very diverse set of stakeholders, then this might be a good indicator that it's a robust decision. And that's because, that's because similar people are prone to have similar blind spots, to make similar mistakes. So if we have a more diversified set of inputs into going into a decision, that's a good signal. And it's also good if we can recognize difference and we can use that as a metric to analyze a decision we can see how much of a public value it has. And often we don't have good enough of a resolution into all of the different social dimensions that exist in communities. We tend to generalize in ways that are harmful to discussions, to our ability to discuss and come together and form shared goals. So that's the first thing. We want to recognize difference, and then after we do that, we really want to find ways through each, okay. I'm not good on Miro, apparently. All right, there we go. So then we want to find ways to bridge those differences, and the process through which we come together to make decisions can really make a meaningful difference in our ability to accept the legitimacy of the compromises that we make with each other. So we want everyone who is involved in a decision to accept those compromises, to accept the final decision. And so we think about what are the different governance designs that can help us maximize that. And that's obviously really hard, but we've been finding out that there are some interesting principles or heuristics that can help us get closer to this goal. So these are a few examples for voting, quadratic voting, for deliberating. What we're going to use today is called bridging-based ranking, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. And there are other models: quadratic funding, partial common ownership, plural money. And you're welcome to go to our website, or we can talk later, and we can explore more of that in detail. And then we try to create the space, the containers in which we can research and discuss these models and continue developing them over time. We create tools, open source tools that help us experiment with some of these concepts. We do gatherings, and most importantly, we do concrete experimentation with these. And we've done many experiments all over the US, in Brazil, in Taiwan, and also with Web3 networks. We saw some of these ideas like quadratic voting and quadratic funding be widely used in the DAO space. But one of the most interesting sectors that we're excited to collaborate with, and the reason why we're so happy and delighted to be working with Serpentine, is really the art sector. And that's because these are social technical concepts. These are not ideas that we can write about and theorize about. We need to test them. We need to iterate on them. We need to experiment with these things, and the kind of multidisciplinary, socio-technical, iterative experimentation that is required for us to start developing this new field of pluralistic technologies and institutional models is exactly what the art world lends itself to. So we are super excited to start doing that today with all of you. And yeah, without further ado, this is what we're going to do today. We're going to explore how can decentralized technologies be harnessed to help bring about a more interoperable cultural sector. We're going to do that using a social technology that is pluralistic, and I'll show you how it's integrating some of the design principles that I talked about. And I also, this is also like one more agenda for us being here today, is that I want to invite you to explore this new way of thinking about social technologies. So this is our agenda. We're going to do the exercise, then we'll analyze the results of the deliberation that we'll do, and we're going to have a little discussion about it afterwards. Okay, so this is the tool that we're going to use. It's very simple. Here's our question, and then you're going to see this question, and you can add responses to it. Each response is going to generate a little card like this, and then others will be able to see the response, and you can do it in an anonymized way, and it's GDPR compliant. And they can agree, disagree, or if they're unsure about it, they'll be able to pass it. So these are the only kinds of interactions that you can have with the tool. You can submit a statement or agree or disagree or pass it. And then Polis is going to analyze all of the data, and it's going to cluster everyone in different opinion groups. and it's going to show what are some of the different patterns that are emerging in this community and what are some of the areas of agreements that different groups have. So it's helping us recognize some of the different social dimensions that exist in this group. And then, importantly, it's going to highlight what are the areas of common ground and consensus that exist across the different social groups. So what are the things that we can agree on? What are the things that we have consensus and that we can also collaborate and start coordinating around? So here's an example of a conversation about Uber, which was a discussion that was held in Taiwan. And this was super interesting. Like here, one example of like the point of common ground was that when Uber came to Taiwan, this brought an opportunity to review questions of safety for passengers. So the kind of thing that everyone can agree. Another point that was illuminated by police was that cabs didn't need to be orange anymore. So just good common sense that sort of cuts through a very polarized conversation and helps everyone come together around common shared goals. So we're going to do this exercise now, and I just want to take 1 minute to talk about what makes a good input to polis. So the first thing is that it needs to be a standalone idea. So we want to make sure that you don't put more than one idea in one statement, because otherwise people are not able to evaluate. They might agree with the first but not agree with the second. So really one idea. There will be some seed statements, so make sure that whatever you're adding is not duplicating something that has already been said. And lastly, we want that to be short, so it's sort of like a tweet. Each idea should be short and concise. And we're going to do that for 15 minutes. I'll share with you the QR code in a moment. But just to talk a little bit about how we're going to structure these 15 minutes. First, we'll take 5 to evaluate the statements that are already there. Then we're going to take more 5 minutes to write new statements, and then more 5 minutes to evaluate each other's statements, so the new statements. But you can break these rules in the following ways. If you feel like you read a statement that almost gets to what you think, but doesn't really get, you can just, you don't need to keep evaluating it. Please go ahead and put in a new statement that sort of frames what you're thinking more accurately. So feel free to elaborate on the statements and add more nuance. And if you came here with someone and you want to discuss, you find you're in doubt about a statement or you want to comment on it with your friend, feel free to do that at any point in those 15 minutes. That said, I will break it through in these 3 different sections, but it's okay to not follow the rules super strictly. So let's get started. Here's the QR code. So hopefully you were able to evaluate a lot of the seed statements that were already there. Now I want you to take a moment to think about your own input to this question, and if you think you have something new to add to this conversation, or you can elaborate a bit on a statement that was already there but didn't quite capture your view, we're going to take 5 more minutes to write in new statements. So I'll be back with you at 8:59, starting now. Right now, many of you might have added new statements, so we want to make sure that we can evaluate as many statements as we can during this exercise. So for the next 5 minutes, I will ask you to go through the remaining statements. You might not finish all of them in 5, and that's okay, but it should already give us a good glimpse of what's going on in this conversation and in this community. So for the next 5 minutes, please go through the new statements and evaluate them. And of course, again, if you feel like you can really add some more nuance or something really meaningful that hasn't been stated before, do it. It's okay to break the rule, but What we're doing right now is to evaluate the statements. This should be your primary task. All right, everyone. So please come back to the room so we can take a look at the report together. We're going to do that as concisely as possible, but hopefully this will give us an interesting analysis of what's going on here. So here are some stats about this conversation. 138 people participated, and out of those, we were able to group 126 into different clusters of opinions. And here we can see how divisive was the conversation. So what's interesting to notice is that there's here, each of these dots corresponds to a statement. And so we can see that they're spread in this line going from consensus statements to divisive statements. So we can see that there's a lot more consensus statements than divisive ones. But let's look into what caused some divisions. So the most divisive statement was about whether decentralized decision-making poses risk for production efficiencies and management. I do secretly and not so secretly hope that this exercise can show how we can have nuanced deliberation in ways that are not so inefficient. But yes, this was the main divergence existing in this group. The next one was NFTs are inaccessible and only serve to widen the divide between art and society. So group A firmly agrees with that, whereas group B and C are sort of partial or disagree with that. This statement is similar to the first one in that it's saying decision-making fatigue and the challenges of managing collective governance may prove too cumbersome to be sustainable long-term. So that's a similar sentiment to this first one. And you can see that whereas Group B mostly disagrees, Groups A and C agree with that. So these are, we'll share the link to the report and you can explore this in more detail afterwards, but now let's look at the different groups that emerge. So Group A is a little bit annoyed with the process. Group A is saying, does anyone else have no idea what is going on? I'm really tired. And Group A also thinks that NFTs are inaccessible, so I don't think that's a coincidence. And you know, Group A is you know, deeply put off by blockchain talk, I guess. This is not a blockchain-based exercise, but hopefully you don't put it all in the same basket. But that said, it's interesting that, okay, let's see the other statements. Decentralized decision-making strategic cannot help underrepresented voices be heard when accessing it relies on so much privilege. Blockchain technologies privilege financialization and speculation in ways that are not compatible with notions of public good. So the first thing to notice is, okay, there are 45 people on Group A, and Groups B and C do not quite agree with these statements. So let's try to find out how these different groups think about these questions by looking at the things that they support. So Group B strongly disagrees that decentralized decision-making poses risk for production efficiencies and management. These are the believers. They think also that blockchain technologies offer transparency by design and over time will offer a diverse perspective on decision-making. They also strongly support incentivizing time-limited issue-specific organizational forms like proto-DAOs that bring together different stakeholders from different sectors. So this group is proposing ideas, and they believe that this is a doable thing and that actually blockchain technologies can be harnessed, and are offering some ideas about that. What's interesting to notice here is that they're not the same as Group C in the sense that Group C actually highly disagrees with this, with the question of the statement about decentralized decision-making posing risks. They actually think that this might be an issue. So let's look at group C and see if we can identify who they are, if we can do a... Sorry. Is this better? Yes. Okay, sorry. So group C, we have 43 people. They think that decentralized decision-making processes pose a risk for production efficiencies. They're also talking about decision-making fatigue and challenges of managing collective governance may prove too cumbersome. So they are skeptical. Let's see what else. That said, they think that over time, blockchain technology may offer a diverse perspective on decision-making. This is the promise, and that the transparency by design is something that can be achieved. So they're not entirely skeptical, not as much as Group A, but they think especially the whole decentralized decision-making part might prove too inefficient. And interestingly, they don't think that NFTs are inaccessible and only serve to widen the divide, so a bit more maybe open-minded or maybe just open to blockchain technology. And they don't think that the legacy cultural sector is beyond. So they're neither blockchain believers nor ultra-conservatives. This is our nuanced Group C. So what's interesting to note is now we got some of the, sorry, we got to see some of the divergences, but now let's look at what can everyone agree about. So where can we start cooperating? And one of the places is maybe we can dive into these divergences and continue discussing them until we see if we gain better understanding of each other's perspectives. But it's interesting to know what are the things that we can all agree about. So lots of things. Create transparent pathways for accessing funding and resources for up-and-coming organizations outside of the state. Everyone can agree on that. Using accessible language and consulting with different groups to make sure people know what you're on about. Highly supported. Creating safe spaces for different opinions to emerge. The jargon used to talk about these technologies is inaccessible and should be simplified. So one more about language. Art world should acknowledge the full extent of invisible labor in the industry. And everyone seems to disagree that NFTs will be our future identity, passports, health record, etc. So there's good agreement. I would say that the questions on language and jargon are a key one to focus for this community, and also about transparency for how funds are accessed. So should we do a little deliberation? I want to invite anyone here first who feels like they identify with some of the views expressed on Group A and feel like they could elaborate a little bit on their views and share with us in more detail. Why do you feel the way that you feel? Any courageous volunteer would like to elaborate a bit more on their views with us? If you feel like you belong on Group A, if you feel like you identify with some of these statements that were supported by Group A. And I'll ask the same for Group B or C. Okay. Rasheen is going to give you a mic.
I just wanted to applaud the people in this group, because normally to do this in a democratic process, you just have to not show up and then you're silent. So I'm really excited when people like this show up in a system. I'm just saying rah rah.
That's amazing. Okay, anyone wants to share their rah rah? Here, I think you? Is that you? Oh no. All right, if there's someone from either Group B or C who feel like they, identify with some of the views that were supported there, you can also raise your hand. We're starting with Group A, but if nobody from group A, nobody else speaks up, then we can go to group B and C, and if someone gets encouraged from group A, we'll move to them afterwards. So to reiterate, group B is interested. Group B actually is the strong believer that decentralized decision-making can be done in ways that don't risk production efficiencies and management. So, and this was the main disagreement, the most divisive statement. So would love to hear from anyone who disagreed with that on why did you disagree with that? Because that seems like a very controversial issue. Someone there.
For that statement, I was interested in kind of the value judgment implicit in being good for or not good for efficiency, and I think in my vote I may have crossed groups because I was not kind of not focused on the benefits of efficiency, and so overall, I guess, to what extent do implicit value judgments in the statements get lost in the vote?
So this is actually a perfect case in which you could add an additional statement reflecting that. So talking about sort of the implicit values and maybe why you don't think efficiency should be a value that we are pursuing or measuring things against. So police, we're doing a short, concise demonstration this night, but it's used over time, and the most ideal way to use it is to actually reflect those things back into the tool so that they can be evaluated. And over time, these algorithms are sort of optimizing for more nuanced statements that help bridge the different groups. So this would be a wonderful addition to the police conversation. I highly encourage you to add it in. But yeah, does anyone feel like they want to respond to that or on why efficiency is a crucial thing, especially someone from Group C who feels very strongly about this statement, in favor of this statement, or Group A? Anyone who agreed with this statement feels like they can elaborate a bit on why they agree?
I neither agree nor disagree. I think that the problem is framed in a strange way because what is efficient? Like what aspect of the decision-making process? The number of stakeholders, the type of stakeholders, the framing of the question, the ability to reframe the question. So I think that needs to be thought of in a very different way. I don't know if efficiency of what? It's such a bizarre word, actually.
Thanks. Hi. I'm kind of a reluctant Group C here. That there are some bits of Group C that I really agree with, particularly around addressing privilege and making sure that access is open, and that maybe some of the tools or the way that we're using them today aren't quite there. But I also kind of agree with thinking about decision making is also kind of based and biased in that privilege as well. And actually, if we're trying to think about decentralized decision-making, we have to think about decision-making as a concept and think about cultures where decision-making is already decentralized and places where there's kind of resistance to decentralizing systems of power and the way that decision-making gets made, because decision-making is so often tied up in power and in privilege. And so I kind of fall mostly into Group C for thinking about things like, are NFTs inaccessible? And I think at this point in time, they absolutely are, because they are largely the playground of privilege right now, because they're not necessarily open and accessible to everyone. But at the same time, I vaguely understand what's going on here. And yes, I am tired, because, we exist in this particular world. Who isn't tired right now? But it's super interesting to see kind of people that fall in between these groups and in between the cracks, because grouping people together in kind of 4 distinct buckets is kind of like that labeling that we all fight against, especially anyone that stands at the cross-section of kind of art and technology, who's probably someone that's been othered at some point in their life, suddenly sat here thinking, you know, yeah, I identify with some of group C, but if you put like a giant C on my forehead, I will come at you. You know, it's that kind of, it's really interesting to see me lumped in with so many other opinions that I both agree and disagree with. It's fascinating, is all.
Thank you. I think that this is actually a great segue to just talk a little bit about why this is relevant and how this can be used. So for example, first, Polis is a tool that is digital, so it can help make a conversation, a deliberation inclusive, because not everybody here, we're all in the same physical space, but you can do that with very, very large groups of people, with thousands of people, and online. And the idea is that these are not sort of static groupings. The entire point is to use the knowledge, the insights that we have about the points of divergence and also about the points of common ground, which emerged very clearly in this exercise, to move things forward, which in a collective group could, getting the degree of insights about these things, the cleavages and areas of common ground, could take a very long time, and we just did an exercise here in half an hour. So the idea is to be able to have deliberations at scale and to have algorithms that are optimizing for consensus. These are the things that are being lifted up, the areas of common ground. And what's interesting is that as you sort of feed back into the platform, the kinds of comments that you brought up about efficiency and what are we talking about and what are the right metrics that we should be thinking about in the cultural sector, as this gets fed back into the platform, likely there will be many others who feel the same way. And as you evolve the conversation, the tool will keep optimizing for more nuanced inputs. So what you want is to sort of capture in a really detailed way, in a rich way, what are the points of pain that people are feeling. And if you're able to do that, if you're able to do good bridging statements, and that's going to be lifted up to the majority. So it's actually completely opposite to the way that social media works today. Twitter is experimenting with this, and it had some really interesting results. It just did one test, but it used this kind of bridge-based ranking to evaluate additional context that could be added to tweets. This was it's still a small experiment called, it was initially called Birdwatch, but then someone in the crowd may know the new name that Twitter gave it. But what was interesting is that Birdwatch, which was using this methodology, added additional input, the tweets that were flagged but with needing additional context, and which ended up getting that there was a tweet from Elon Musk himself that he later deleted, and then another from the White House. So this is a good way of capturing the collective intelligence of the public and sort of putting a check in other forms of power, capitalism, capitalist power, or governmental power. So that's what can be interesting. You can use that in a hybrid way, so to facilitate an in-person conversation, but have people put inputs here before, so that you direct the conversation with those insights in mind. You can turn that into a vote later on, and there are many interesting ways of doing that. Hopefully, this can show a way through which we can recognize different social dimensions in a group, and then foster cooperation across these groups by highlighting these majority-supported statements. And hopefully this can create a very concrete picture in your mind about what we mean by pluralistic technologies, and maybe, if that's not too ambitious, leaves us a bit more optimistic for the potential for decentralized governance to be done in a way that doesn't risk efficiencies. Yeah, and we would love to open for question and answers, but maybe you have something else to share before. Oh, and one last point is we're going to share with all of you a more detailed, rich analysis of the conversation. You can keep engaging with it. And lastly, can we get back to Mira? If you want to take a look at the report, the link will be bit.ly. Go down here. Oh.
Which one?
More, scroll down. Just, I think it's way below. bit.ly/SERP report. It should be there, but it's not. But bit.ly/SERP report, and we're also going to send it to you over email.
Right. So I think at this stage, it seems the sentiment analysis points us towards the conclusion of this part, the second part. Thanks so much. Some final words, Hans-Ulrich? But also, do stick around. Please tell us how to simplify the language. Would love to hear some feedback. It is a collective struggle of the cultural field to bring together so much and still be clear. So let's try to do that together.
Thank you so much. We should give a big round of applause to Radical Exchange. Thank you so much. And thank you all so much for being here, for participating tonight, everyone, for joining. Thanks to Ralph, to Florence, to Chris, to Gary, to everybody who worked on the amazing report. And thanks again to our dream team, to Victoria, to Eva, to Roisin, to Alex, to Tamar, and to Kay. Thank you so much.